We're going to have another session on the Colonias today and get a lot more information. I'll just briefly mention our speakers, and you can read their names on the screen possibly. To your far right is Sylvia Sierra. I gave you a detailed biography on her yesterday. I don't want to go through it all again. Next is Sandra Tatum. And then the speaker who was a little late yesterday is Dr. Nunez Maturi, and she's an associate professor of anthropology and director of women and gender studies at UTEP. Her classes incorporate research and community engagement opportunities through service learning. Dr. Nunez received her PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of California, Riverside in 2006, and she'll be mentioning more details. And then Oscar Vasquez, who most of you know already as a former county commissioner. So I will let them proceed, and I'll try to keep up with the slides. We do have some index cards. If anyone has a comment or question you would like to have them answer, we'll pick them up at intermission, but we'll hand out the cards right now if anybody's interested. Raise your hand.
Buenos días. Good morning. Before I start, I want to acknowledge a question regarding my pronouns. It's a Hupil, Hupil, and it's from Coban in Guatemala. So it's handmade, and I'm honored to wear it. So we can start with the first slide. We want to recap for those that may have not been here on Monday. This presentation is. This presentation is about colonias. So on Monday we went over. We had a journey over time, and actually to pinpoint where we are in time. So we went back to when this was Spain and the territory in the 1600s, and then we also looked at the Gaston Purchase. We went over the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo briefly, and the Gaston Purchase that it mentioned that it was signed in La Posta, so many of you know La Posta. And we also went over the definitions of colonias, and we will have that, Dr. Nunez will do that again today, reaffirm what is the definition of colonias along the U.S.-Mexico border. So there's 1,954 miles. That's the border from California all the way to Texas. There's 1,800 colonias just in Texas, and it's probably more than that. There's 138, 150 colonias in New Mexico. Of those 150 or so, 37 are in Doña Ana County. I think 77 in Arizona, and less than 40 in California. So then we went over what is the border. Is 62.5, 100 kilometers from the boundary of the border north, and the same south. So that boundary, the border boundary, is it's very important for Environmental Protection Services Administration, the United States Agriculture Department, Housing and Urban Development. So there's a lot of funding available, federal funding, for colonias along the border. Most of the funding, of course, is in the U.S. side. So we want to give you a perspective of colonias, but a broader view from along the border. And then today we wanted to get really specific to Doña Ana County. Okay? And today, Dr. Nunez is going to give a deep brief on colonias and go over the definition again. It is a very, for some people, very complicated. What is a colonia? So we're going to go over, so we can have the first slide. The definition should be what is an incorporated community and unincorporated community. And know that some of the colonias, when they were designated colonias, they were not incorporated, such as Anthony. And so Las Cruces has, Doña Ana County has 5 incorporated communities. Las Cruces, Mesilla, Hatch, Anthony, and Sunland Park. Sunland Park and Anthony were colonias before they were incorporated. So they still remain with the incorporated definition, with the colonial designation.
Good morning. Thank you for coming and joining us today. So we are going to talk about the social and physical infrastructure, colonias and basic human needs such as water, wastewater, road, also public lighting. I want to thank Sylvia. Just for a recap, I think it's really important to get the different perspective that we're presenting as a panel because Sylvia was in Health and Human Services within the county. Sandy lives in a colonia and also has been an entrepreneur in the community. And Commissioner Butler served as a public servant representing this county, and then I came in as a graduate researcher, documenting the stories of the people who live there. Okay. So New Mexico's population, the density of colonias, you see them, they tend to be tied to major arteries of transportation. So if I can have you imagine the overlapping definitions of these colonias and where we are when we define these communities from different policy perspectives, from different humanitarian perspectives. Do we define colonias as an environmental issue? Do we define colonias as a housing and social justice issue? Do we define colonias as traditional historical farm working communities? Do we define them as a human rights issue? Do we define them as strategic communities in important migration corridors? I would argue that we can, all of those fit into the definition of colonia, which is why it's complicated because you might have someone speaking about colonias through an environmental justice, right? There's raw sewage, there's flooding, there's not enough infrastructure, so when we do have those flash floods, we have a lot of threats to human, thank you. So right here. So they're really important because they're on I-35 high. But because we have a U.S.-Mexico border that's almost 2,000 miles, you'll see a lot of trade routes. Right? Maquilas on the border sending what they produce throughout the United States. This corridor is incredibly important. Location, location, location matters. Right? And what's so stunning is that most of us don't know they exist. Most of us have never seen them. Most of us don't know where they're located or how to get there. That's a big mystery. How do we get to them? Right? Because we drive by, but they tend to be out of sight and out of mind. And so one of our big challenges and invitations is to make the invisible visible. Right? And my question to you, why I thought about the index cards, is why should we care? Why should we care that these communities exist? And I want you to think about that because your index card has 2 sides. One is what creates community? What does community mean to you? Why should we care that these communities exist? So think about that, and then I really would like to see your responses. And it's an invitation to share your thoughts with me because I have come from California to try to let people know that these communities exist. And one of my biggest challenges is to speak to the different federal agencies and say, come visit New Mexico. Come see what I'm seeing, right? Someone's got to care that these communities exist in these conditions. And so I need your help. I need your help in communicating that message. Why should we care? And I see you as a community of conscious people, right? You're lifelong learners. You want to continue learning. You want to continue being engaged. You want to make an impact and a difference. And that's how every time I enter a new space, a new classroom, when people ask me to give a talk, I walk in and I know that there's tremendous collective knowledge in this room. And that I don't have all the answers, but that together we can do a lot more to make these communities visible. So here are some of the different definitions. The farm housing provision, the U.S. Code defines colonias as communities located within 150 miles. Right here. This is critical. And they need to have existed before November 28, 1990. The definition of colonias varies from 62.5 miles or kilometers to 150 miles for federal funding purposes. So this is one of the biggest challenges. And when I came here, it's like, wait a minute, you have 3 different agencies with different definitions. USDA borrowed HUDs. EPA has its own definition. And one of the biggest challenges is that the 3 major federal agencies were not on the same page. Right? So it was not uncommon for someone to come and pave a road and then later realized that there was no sewage. So they had to come break the roads and then pipe in the sewage or the water. It made no sense, right? That the 3 major federal agencies were not collaborating, right? So that was a challenge. I'm like, what? You're all like have offices next to each other. Why are y'all not talking? And they're like, this kid from California is asking all these questions, right? More than 2,000 colonias, unincorporated, most of them outside of city limits, so they fall within the boundaries of counties, rural counties. And that's important because if you're not incorporated, you don't have city government, you don't have law enforcement, you don't have that accountability of elected officials. And if you're outside in the county, there's usually 2 or 3 sheriffs working at any given time. So in times of emergency, it's really difficult to get law enforcement and representation out into the communities. And then going in a county, what was important is that we have 37 of them. And my entrance into these communities came in as a grad student, and I was hired by the U.S. Census Bureau. And they said, help us find these communities. Let's count them. We need to count them. And there was a resident that was really sharp and very witty. And she pulled out a map and she's like, your job, little girl, is to tell them we exist. Right? And we've been here for a long time. Yes, ma'am. And I said, these communities have been here for a long time. Rhodey had a church that was dated in the front that says, do not cross private property. So I was really hesitant to ever knock on that door. And then finally the owner said, you're the only one who has ever read that sign and cares about it, right? But I'm like, you're telling me that you all been here since 1880? And she's like, yes, we've been here since 1880. I said, you don't have paved roads and sewage, right? And I met World War II veterans, Vietnam veterans. How is that acceptable to anyone? Right? And they're like, we fought for this country, we've been living here for a long time, but nobody knows we exist. Right? So that lady that took me to task, you tell them we exist, that was my job. Once we presented it in Suitland, Maryland, I was asked what part of Latin America we're talking about. Right? And someone sat there with a 3-piece suit. What part of Latin America is this? I said, there's 5 research teams. You all hired us. Right? And it's Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas. And there's a lot more attention to Texas because it's such a big state. Right? And there's so many more of them. And so my goal was to make New Mexico colonias visible and significant. So what are colonias? I think it's important that we pay attention to some of the historical communities because there's this notion that they're illegitimate and they don't belong, right? They're all just these Mexican immigrant populations and they just don't belong here. They have no right asking for services. And I said, no, right? Bracito has been around since the 1700s. Tortugas, 1600s. La Mesa, 1800s. Hatch, 1851. That is now an incorporated community. But Hatch does not feel it has a responsibility to provide services to the colonies around it, right? Yet it depends on that population for its tax base. I interviewed 75 households in 5 colonies around Hatch. They go shop there. They gas up there. They send their kids there. What would happen to Hatch without the colonias? Right? We would see empty rural communities throughout New Mexico. Fort Selden, 1865. Oregon Post Office, 1881. Berino, 1902. Chamberino, 1889. La Union, 1909. Vado, 1911. Vado is where I went to community centers, and I had African American seniors come up to me and say, we've been here for a long time. We have worked on the railroad, right? Tell them we don't have sewage. Yes, sir, right. Yes, right. And then when the engineers would lay out their plans, the people would say, these engineers have no clue. They've never walked our communities. They want to plan roads where there's an arroyo. These engineers know nothing, right? The elders had walked the community. The elders had a lot to share with the engineers. But we really need to engage in that dialogue, the people who actually know the land.
I want to continue on this slide. The dates given here are dates that, because we're under the United States system, we need papers to prove that land tenure and post office and people were there. The histories actually go way back, way back. And it's very important to remember that, and to remember that in land tenure, there's different systems and different impetus that account for the settlement all along the Rio Grande Valley. There, you have your conquistadors. You have the changes in with Mexican independence, and you have the Europeans coming, and then eventually those treaties that gave the U.S. jurisdiction over tremendous amounts of property. But the land tenure itself is very complicated because there were grants from kings, grants from Mexican government, and then also grants affirmed by U.S. occupation that at times allowed in some of these communities where the boundaries of treaties weren't definite, allowed them choice of whether they would remain Mexican citizens or U.S., and there was accommodation. And this is the factor in our communities and along the border, that there's great creativity, accommodation, and rubbing up against each other in different ways in different systems. You can imagine if you woke up one day and were told you belong to the King of Spain. Time passes, you're told you're now Mexican. Later on, you're told you're U.S. citizens. All these complications go into any of the research that you do in any of these communities. I would like to also remind you as you look at these, and also
It's people who care for each other. When someone dies, it's the neighbor that sends a meal because that family is in grief. When someone is building a different room for their children or grandchildren, it's the neighbor that comes with their tools and their skills, and they help that neighbor out. And I think that if we study urbanization and urban life, what we oftentimes don't pay attention to is that we can become anonymous. And for some, that's very empowering. Nobody watches my movements and I can be who I am. But also, we're very lonely. People talk about Americans as, why are you all self-medicating so much? Why are people so alone? Why are we over-consuming? Oftentimes it's to make up for a sense of loneliness, of disconnect. So my invitation is to connect. Know your neighbors. Care about your community. And bring others in. In October, many years ago, when I was doing my research, it was Make a Difference Day. I came to the community college and I said, can you have your students come out with me? I talked to builders and say, could you lend me your equipment for a day and some guys who know how to use it? And we focused on 8 homes, mostly widows, single mothers. There were some construction guys putting a glass on a window for a little boy who slept in a trailer and his room had no windows, and it was the winter. for a child who was afraid he was going to fall through because his bathroom floor was collapsing. Together, these individuals helped me put a window. They helped me fix some of the homes for the widows. A World War II veteran who never left his house because he was afraid that they would steal his medals. And his granddaughter worked at the Hatch Clinic and said, would you help my grandpa? He's a World War II veteran. I said, let us know where he lives. He never wants to go have lunch with us on Sundays. He always wants to go home. He never wants to leave home. He's a World War II veteran. He's a prisoner in his own home. And I had the construction guys come out with me. One day, make a difference day. Right? Imagine if most of us adopted out. Today I will do something. Today I will do something to humanize, to bring out my skills or my tools and help that widow, help that veteran fix that door so he can enjoy his family the rest of his days. There's lots of people out there, and our goal is to humanize them and connect with them. Yes, there's a question.
If there's a fire in Colonia, then who responds if there's no infrastructure for that? Does the county go in? What happens?
We do have, yes, the county, and we have volunteer fire services throughout the colonias. And actually, the volunteer fire service made out of community members are the ones that are helping when the community floods. Probably 6 years ago, some of those volunteer fire departments became paid staff. So there's some paid volunteer, fire departments throughout the county, Oregon, Doña Ana, but the county is the one that responds.
Yeah, but you're gonna put out a fire in the colonias and you can't get to it because the roads are, it's raining and the roads are muddy, you're done, you can't get to it.
Those
Yeah.
homes will burn up in 30 minutes. Some of those homes will burn in 30 minutes. It's like a matchbox.
Yeah.
And there's only 19 paid fire departments, 16 paid fire.
And one likes to be registered.
So that is a
There's
huge,
a water with you.
that is a huge challenge. And when we tour the colonia, fire hazard is evident, and there's not a lot of fire hydrants. So it is a challenge.
Of course, because look how they heat their home.
Well, we do have other maps that we can make. We do have another water services. We didn't talk about that. There's almost more than 200 water associations just in Doña Ana County. So you have all kinds of water associations. You could think, well, we should have a lot of water hydrants and prevention, but they're very small. It could be a trailer park, and then so the water association and the regionalization of the water association is an issue. The next one. We do have, some of the colonias have New Mexico Gas Company and Zia Gas. So they do have, but the majority are on propane. In some of the communities opt not to hook up to either one because they can't control the cost. And they feel that having propane, they can control the cost. They can control when they can fill the tank. And another thing that happens, which is extremely dangerous, they go to Juarez or they go to Palomas to fill their little tanks of propane, and that's a hazard for all of us on the roads. So a lot of them do have wood stoves. And you're right, this goes to the roads. There's a lot of roads that need to be maintained. So that's a huge issue for the roads. Do we have any other questions?
I have several other questions.
Yes.
I was just wondering, to what extent, if at all, are the colonias vulnerable to the influx from cartels? To what extent are there drug problems and health issues and colonias can look to for help?
One of the things that we did with Health and Human Services is that we have they have community centers. So Chaparral has community centers, Rincon, Doña Ana, La Mesa, Vado, and we do have senior meals. We do have staff going to all these community centers. We do have federally qualified health centers, La Clínica de Familia and Ben Archer. They have contracts with the county and they have expanded their sites. Through the La Clínica de Familia, they have now provide pharmacy services, mental health, and then, of course, physical health. The problem is transportation. So the next one. Transportation. So this is hopefully at the next session we can talk about the social. The uninsured is an issue. The access to care because of transportation. Transportation, even though we have a new system, is where the access to that system of transportation is very, very limited, and then affordable housing. We do have high incidence of diabetes. Diabetes is associated with mental health. We have high incidence of asthma, respiratory problems because of the condition. We do have a lot of seniors in those areas, so because of the limited access to walking and going for walking and exercising, so there's a lot of them have fallen, and so there's a lot. Because of the violence in Juarez and the issues along the border, we can tell you that we have seen a high density, the population density increase along the colonias. So a lot of people, if you tour some of the colonias, some of the communities, you see the home in the front, and you see trailers or fifth wheel parked in the back where they're housing in relatives that are trying to escape the violence along the border. Any other questions?
We wondered for a long time, we live in the Sea Park, and we have wondered for a long time why Walgreens doesn't come down in that direction. And there's a whole strip along the highway there where there are empty buildings, good property, maybe it's close to the railroad tracks. Maybe that's what discourages them. But what would be the factors in why that's not being developed, and why major companies such as Walgreens would ignore that area in coming into use?
Population size and density. They have formulas. Like, you need infrastructure to have business. It's really hard. It's a chicken or the egg. If you don't have infrastructure, it's really difficult to attract business. Right? We need basic infrastructure. Anyone familiar with Maslow's hierarchies of needs? Right? There are basic needs you need to supply a society for it to thrive. Right? If we cannot submit and actually invest in basic needs, we can't attract businesses. We won't have the urban density, the population size for them to be solvent.
Infrastructure, is that roads and sidewalks?
Mesilla Park, I would urge you, it's true what Gina just said, but I would go and meet with your commissioner. Commissioner Garrett is still, and ask, what can you do? And I truly believe in the power of community meetings. Have a community meeting, call a community meeting, and call the representatives of the entities, and ask, this is what we need, and this is the population. Once you see the numbers of people and emphasize why it's needed, even though you know we're going to have a Walgreens and a CVS right next to each other, I would challenge the commissioner. I think it's very, very important to challenge the commissioners because they represent us. It's very important to challenge them and say, this is what we need, and I elected you. So if community meetings happen at home, community can be in your living room, or you can ask for a community meeting at the county building. and then engage people to come and attend the meeting and make a case for why it's needed. So, yeah,
So-
yes.
So I understand that many of the people in the Colonias are fearful of the federal government because of its current positions for immigration, but historically, the federal government has built infrastructure with REA, TVA, CCC. Are we putting pressure on the federal government to do something about this horrendous situation?
Yes, not anymore though, but when we had the Colonias initiative, we had a mechanism of getting the capital outlay request, which is the form with all the BS and everything that says what road and the engineering, and then going to the state level and saying who is going to sponsor this from the representative to the Senate, and then we would meet with Domenici and the Senate, and then we would ask them for the National Association of Counties conference. Can you go with us to the Housing and Urban Development, the Commerce Department, all these entities that have the funding, and then and you go with us to the meetings so we can get funding for this specific projects. A lot of the projects, especially flood projects, are multi-million-dollar projects. So the federal government is key.
It's key. However, when I started my research, I had someone from public radio interview me, and then they interviewed Domenici's office, and the responses were a country at war. We don't care about poor people right now.
Wow.
And then I said, well, eventually we're going to come home, right? That we're not always going to be a country at war. We're going to have to come home and build our nation. And we've got to build the infrastructure. We have infrastructure that has not been invested in for decades. And we will have a collapse of infrastructure. Water, pipes, drainage, we're already seeing it. And that further exacerbates our health and our decline in our quality of life. So there are basic needs that need to continue to be addressed.
I guess I'm still confused. I own a condo in the Picacho Hills, and I've always had water, sewer, all the amenities, and then I don't see even the Picacho Hills even listed here, but it says, is it part of Fair Acres or?
Well, Picacho Hills, keep in mind, that's a very upper middle class and not a wealthy affluent community. So that developer put in all the infrastructure that would be a draw to buy there.
Okay, see, yeah,
And so-
that wasn't done by a government.
Right.
An individual went in there and put in the water,
Right.
sewer.
But
And anybody could do that, right, in any of these?
well, any developer that can do it, you know, to attract a buyer that has the money to buy up there, right? It's very selective, those who can buy there, but if you look at the foothills of Picacho Hill, you have a colonia right at the base called Picacho.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't even know about that.
Yeah, so you have that one that is lacking in infrastructure, and it's just one road that goes in there, and then you have some paved roads, some dirt roads, you have trailers, and you have manufactured homes, and that's site-built home. So, yeah, that's a colonia at the base, but Picacho Hills, that's a totally affluent community that a developer went in there, but Picacho Water then at one time didn't have the water
So
pressure.
that water company
Yeah.
doesn't go down to Picacho.
Well, Doñana Water, through the Colonias Infrastructure Fund, is now taking water over there where they have not.
Also anticipate finding out how much older they are than these days, that you couch them within the county as it is today, the factors of the county that are static, the landmass, the location. The county has almost 4,000 square miles of land. 80% of that is public land. So where do people settle? Where do people settle? The agricultural tenure in business comprises about 100 square miles out of that 4,000. So when we stereotype these communities as being all Mexican, all agriculture, we're kind of turning our back on the dynamic that really was settlement here. And we're ignoring the fact that forever and a day, foreign and outside enterprise has been responsible for development in Mexico and here too. That oftentimes the boom-bust process in the West happens because investors and businesses are not entirely geared or caring about the development of the people themselves. As long as there's a workforce, however you get that, that's the aim. Our romance with the cattle industry it exhibits the same thing. You wouldn't guess that some of the cowboys in our mythology were actually working for Scots, big landowners from Scotland. Makes it a very interesting history, and one where you are constantly being asked to upset the constructs that you have about, and the myths that we have about the border, Mexico, the U.S. So I salute everybody who puts themselves in that position to shake that up. And when we look at our communities and go see them and realize that the dynamic of the people's lives and the tenure of the land, the maintenance of a cultural life that involves community, caring for each other, it's often done in the face of global and regional currents that aren't really supporting the life in those communities. And that's one thing that the commitment that you hear expressed here and investment is because we know that the Colonia of Good Samaritan is dependent on the services and the tenure of people in the colonias who are half the population of our county. Time? Oh,
I care about it.
I want to keep it on time, but okay. Our architecture in many colonias, the faith-based organization within many colonias exhibits the roots going back. And Catholicism is not, along the El Camino Real, is not the only manifestation of faith. As I said yesterday, when you go to colonias, you find that mixture of First Nation people who've kept their traditions too and mingle them with the Spanish and Mexican tradition and with the Europeans that came here too, and that's a very dynamic mixture. We gave some figures yesterday about what you find in colonias in the neglected infrastructure. These pictures show you what we're talking about in terms of needing the colonias identification, the unincorporated areas lacking basic infrastructure. Many of them developed out of old historical settlements. Some of them developed illegally without laws determining that there would be infrastructure if you were subdividing land, that your escrow accounts would be have to address these kinds of factors of safety and development. You see lack of running water. There are colonias where people still carry their water in barrels. There are colonias that have people share electric lines and water lines. There are places where the housing issue prompts people to have to make shelters out of materials that are less than spec, as you see here. There are places where the sewage is taken care of by old-fashioned cesspools, and our septics, and mostly by septic system. We still allow development in this valley by septic, and with climate change and both lowering water levels and flooding, we're on the cusp of some pretty critical conditions as our climate changes here, because many people use septic tanks. The crises that have affected the whole valley from one side to the other, the 2006 flooding, those revealed to many that the neglect costs everybody. When you rise to a crisis, because children are walking in cow shit that's flooded out of the dairies, or they're on an island because water from higher ground has washed around them and there's no place to go, or down lower where, because it was dry for a long time, the pathways of water to the river were neglected. That happened out in Radium Springs and Fort Selden. All this reveals that it costs everybody, and it costs the vitality and dynamic that is shared from all the communities. And so that's another reason why Gina's question of why should we care, it's because we're all affected. It's an interdependent system, regardless of whether people have been visible for a long time or not. The map. Thank you. The map of the location of the colonias, you can see there along the river channel, where it used to be, in places where you don't see it now because we channelized the river. But you can pretty well, you get a clear idea of that central corridor up through our valley by I-25 and Highway 185. And we have more maps to pass out. Yesterday, we ran out of them Monday, so that we have more. We are, as a county, we are having to deal with the fact that for a long time, the neglect did not reveal to public officials as a lack of regulation or laws. And that has allowed recent development of colonias that break your heart sometimes, since we know better. We know better. And to ameliorate conditions when people are already living there, already have established their homes and their relationships to each other, and then when you try to come in and make a one rule fits all, it's a heartbreaking situation. And I know that from serving on the Planning and Zoning Commission, when you get a picture like one of those you saw before, or you get a picture of someone where there was a complaint about what they were building on their property or how close to lines, and you try to deal with that under regulation, and you're looking at an aerial photograph where this is the person that got the complaint, but the aerial photograph shows that all around them, similar conditions exist. And how do you ameliorate that in a just and supportive way for the community life that already exists? So it's a very complicated situation to deal with all those factors that Gina mentioned, environmental justice, social housing, etc., etc. Subdivisions and the requirements of builders so that we prevent the creation of neighborhoods where the needs of the people aren't met, where maybe you only live there because you could afford to make the land payment, but there weren't the necessary infrastructure for your family, but to live in community with other people. We know that once you get a population together, you have different sets of needs and problems that come forward. And I know that from Raven Springs, as we experience the population development, and people who lived there forever had to rise to the fact that, it was different now, and it begins to change that the requirements, and to get collaboration, cooperation, your voice out in your communities to authorities so that you can begin to ameliorate situations and provide for the safety and the justice in your community.
We want to give you an opportunity to ask questions before the break. So, do you have any questions so far?
Has there been any thought on these colonias incorporated, since their neighborhoods incorporated into a city?
The question was, has there been any thought of this colonias incorporated into a city? One example is Chaparral. Chaparral is, I think it's more than 16,000 people. Chaparral actually is in two counties. It's in Yotero and Doña Ana County. That community has attempted to incorporate high tech. So this is the whole area. The community had attempted to incorporate, and they failed. So there's this community is much larger in population density than probably Hatch, and pretty close to Anthony. But because it's two, and we don't know because it was two counties that it was a challenge. A lot of the residents that live in Chaparral actually work in El Paso. And some of them say we like the rural nature of the community. We like not having lights. Some people say we want to live in the Wild West. So, and there's some communities because if you drive to Highway 54 toward Paso, you take I-10 and take O'Hara Road. I don't know how many people have driven that. If you drive at 7 o'clock in the morning or earlier, you see the state line that divides Texas from New Mexico, and then you see this dust, especially when they're during the week. You see this dust over covering Chaparral. Most of the roads are unpaved, and so they have a high, and that is health related. It triggers asthma, has all kinds of implications from the health perspective. So we try to present that as an urgency for them to incorporate. As of 2 weeks ago that I went to Chaparral, there's a lot more business. So we're hoping there's more gross receipt taxes and more incentive for them to attempt to incorporate again. Yes.
Are there any minimum or maximum population numbers to qualify to be a colony?
Yes. Minimum, yes, minimum I think is 20,000, 25,000. 25,000 or less, and maximum I think is. That's the max. 25,000 or less. Yet, there are some colonias that I know of, I don't know.
Some have 30 households, so, they're not gonna have a city council, each resident would be a representative. Some are smaller households, and so they don't have a lot of
So
representation.
you could have one with 10 people in it?
In the definition.
Yeah, so there's a maximum,
So a lot of them were, so before they had farmer communities, and farmer communities, people were put in sheds or in bunk beds, right? And if people were migrant, they would just use those as temporary labor camps. But then some people started to settle, and once you have a family, then you want your own household, right? And then you have a congregation of households. So one community had like 30 households, because I got to interview almost every single one of them. And it really takes you to, what is it to know your neighbors? What are the values of community? And so for some, they knew their neighbors because there was 30 households. They found out who was sick, who wasn't moving, who if you don't see so-and-so, then you send your kids over and ask how they're doing. So I really think about what a neighborhood means and what a community means, right? So when you just say they're just population settlements versus their communities, the language we use is very powerful, right? On how we value people. And we say that, well, they're just settlements, they really shouldn't be there, right? Some, like Anthony, are more like bedroom communities. Chaparral, a lot of people work out in the White Sands, right? So demographically, you'll see a lot more Anglos in Chaparral, a lot more veterans, or a lot of people working for the federal government, but they drive back and forth. And it's closer than having to drive in from El Paso, right? And that's their neighborhood. But when it rains, the biggest challenge is you can't get in and you can't get out. Yes?
What sort of legal obligations does incorporating entail? In other words, do you have to have a mayor, city council, police, fire,
A tax base. Yeah, that's expensive. So Sunland Park incorporated, but they've had a historical struggle to stay afloat because you have to pay law enforcement. They do have a DMV office, right? They have a motor vehicle office. So that's important for getting your ID, for getting your driver's license. That's important. When you don't have amenities that we have in cities, people struggle, right? When you don't have access to health care, you don't have access to stores that are open at night, and you need milk for your kids, and they're crying because they want milk.
But do you have to have a mayor and a city council?
In a city council, you have a mayor, you have law enforcement, so there are basic amenities of representation, right? Taxation and representation that takes place in cities.
There's a community on the east side of the freeway across from Doñana that tried to incorporate. There's a lot of enthusiasm, and then when they ran into the difficulty of developing leadership within the community to take those required positions and to sustain them with dedicated taxes from the people, it exposed the fact that they really weren't quite ready to make that commitment. And so many times people who when we talk about incorporated versus unincorporated, we're not quite realistic about the requirements to sustain a governing body for a group of people who have an identified community. And that's why some of us have worked so hard to try and encourage in the county itself a dedication to the infrastructure in these communities so that as they grow, they can, the people can do that with the minimum of strength that water, drainage, sewage, and roads allow for a community. And with the hope that you will to be able to develop the governmental voice that you people in your community want.
I think it's time for a break, and we'll get your questions, and then we'll try to address them before we start, right after the break. Thank you.
Okay, let's get started. I think we have more questions than answers, so we're going to have to do this quickly. I wanted to just start and let you know that now you know what I inherited as a commissioner. Because when we talk about colonias, I came from California. I knew of barrios, as I mentioned, when I first made my presentation. But the barrio I grew up in, keep in mind that it was made up of Armenians, Russians, Japanese who just come out of internment camps. I'm talking about 1945, 46. And Mexicans that were coming up from the border looking for work. So I grew up in a very diversified community. There was Armenians there too. So my friends were across from Europe, from Mexico, and I had a lot of Japanese friends that were Nisei, Sansei. So I started to learn Japanese, right? And we had a lot of Jewish people there too. But when I came here, 90% of the colonias Hispanic, right? Few blacks, few whites. I had to really learn Spanish again because man, I was getting punished and they sat me in the hallway or in the closet because I didn't speak English. So then I finally spoke English and came over here and I had to learn Spanish. So, muchísimas gracias que están aquí y buenos días. But keep in mind that I wanted to start really with a question about incorporation. We have 37 colonias. They're made up of primarily people who work in agriculture and dairies. There's a lot of professionals in there. Police, sheriff, engineers, doctors, people who inherited their mother's home and don't want to leave and buy a house and are very attached to their community. So it's a mix. Very few, 2, 3, 4%. The rest are working for minimum wage or less. And if you look at my district, the one I had, here's Garfield. Right here's Las Palmeras. All of those were mine. So I came with a full head of hair. I used to have a flat top. Now it's just a round top. But answering your question on incorporating, that's a very difficult process. Each colonia can ask the county that they want to incorporate. Any city can annex a colonia anytime they want to. But the cities don't want to do it because you have infrastructure problems that they don't want to inherit, and it's too costly for them. What the city does is, like in Tortugas, they had a little strip mall with a gas station, an auto repair shop, a Family Dollar, and a little restaurant. And what the city did is they annexed that little strip for gross receipts tax, but left the colonia alone. And keep in mind, incorporation requires that that particular community can sustain itself with water, with wastewater, with police service, with fire service, with sewerage, and all the things that public service needs that residents require. When you have a low-income base, where some of these colonias are 100% poverty, 75 and 80% poverty, they don't have the income to incorporate. And the county, what it does is it has approximately, I would say, 85% of how it sustains itself is property tax. And the city sustains itself with gross receipts tax. But if you can barely live and cover the roof on your head with some corrugated metal to keep warm at night, and like they mentioned earlier in our presentation, with hail, yeah, you believe you're in a war zone. But you don't have the gross receipts tax to incorporate, and the county does not annex because it doesn't have the money to really sponsor another city within a jurisdiction. It doesn't have the authority from the state. What we do have is a split system. One gets the majority of gross receipts tax, the other one gets the majority of property tax, and that's what sustains us. But hopefully that addresses the question. If it doesn't, I'll try to leave some time at the end of the session so that we can address it, and then some raise some question about funding too. But okay, so I inherited 26 of the Colonias 30 of the 37, 2/3 say. The big issue here is trying to get communities interested and involved, right, in their own communities. We're workers, and yet even outside of those communities, you have apathy. You really don't feel comfortable with your elected officials. You really feel like you elect them, they come and knock on the door during campaigns, but they don't do a damn thing after the campaign. They legislate from the bench, but they never get out into the communities. So what I did was, in 2003, I put as a county goal the Colonias Initiative. And that was to address the very problems of infrastructure, water, wastewater, flood, drainage, roads. And that's not even talking about community centers and fire stations and a lot of other physical infrastructures that are missing in these communities. And as I mentioned in my presentation, there was recently 6 fire districts that are no longer rated eligible to provide fire service in 16 of the fire districts because they don't have enough staff to staff them. But some of these communities have one hydrant, and it may be a population of 5,000 there, it could be a population of 50. But nevertheless, if you have one hydrant, and the first time we got funding for one of them, and we found that that hydrant didn't even have a pipe to supply water. Okay, that gave me a heads up, right? When I told you earlier, I went into Milagro and I was walking on raw sewage softly because I didn't know if it was quicksand. But the county didn't get involved. It's a private community, and there's an anti-donation provision in the state constitution that says public dollars are not to be spent on private property. It's anti-donation. 37 counties that are private. Some are historical. I'm very proud of it. Being Latino, Mexican, and as I mentioned earlier, some people have called me wetback, only because I was an anchor baby, right? And I didn't speak English. Nevertheless, we have 37 colonias that they're primarily the labor, the backbone of agriculture, dairies, historically railroads and mines, right? And now we're a service economy. They work in McDonald's, they work in Whataburger, Lotta Burger, any kind of burger, wherever you can get a job. They need a job. They work as daycare attendants, they work in your home, they're landscaping, they clean your yards, right? So we have a service economy that is dependent now on cheap labor. We have the dairies and agriculture, sure, you pick the chile, the potato, not the potatoes, the onions, the cabbage, the lettuce. But nevertheless, when you see the condition they're in, lacking in infrastructure, that's one of those things where you say, can you live with septic? And then you don't have the money to clean the septic tank, and it starts flowing out. We have communities like that, right? The septic tanks break down, they become cesspools. Right here in the city limits on Isidro, they're all cesspools. You talk about groundwater contamination, the city or the county isn't moving on it because the anti-donation provision. So when I mentioned that fire hydrant that didn't have water to it, I just toured a colonia here in Bracito, one of the oldest colonias established here. I forgot the date, 18 something, but I live in one in the outskirts. Loniana's 1842. And we still have arroyos that take over the roads and clean out the roads and expose the water and electrical lines and telephone lines. So the other day I met with the county and I said, look, why can't we put a culvert here and cover this and protect, or do something to protect the water lines? Because it's private property. And that arroyo, the adjacent properties, one is easement, the other one's part of its easement. If you dedicate the land to the county, they still won't fix it because they don't have the revenue. We have a situation right now where there is a mix of people living there, many of them Hispanic, with low income, low pay, and they've been there historically. We have some that are incorporated, Anthony and Summit Park, like they mentioned. Santa Teresa wants to incorporate, and Anthony fights it. Some of the community don't want to incorporate it, they vote against it. But for the most part, that would be Summit Park's revenue base to sustain itself. So we're in between a situation where somebody said in one of the questions, why don't you have the county fund these? The county's out in La La Land. We've taxed ourselves for a spaceport, right? That one day we're all going to be flying around and looking down. And it's $200,000 the ticket. So is that for us? You know, we could have taxed ourselves. I demonstrated and boycotted against the spaceport. And a lot of people believe in your progressives, and this is really getting us into the 21st century. But when you see this on the map, are we really getting there? Are we neglecting? Are we ignoring? And yet the conditions within those colonias, when you have cesspools, you have water to hydrants that aren't there operable, you have people putting in trailers. 70 to 80% of these homes have manufactured homes, right? 10-15% have trailers. The other 5% or less are site-built homes, but those are the older citizens or those who have a good job, you know, and inherited a house and they rent that and it's the house payment or mortgage payment. But we have a serious situation. It's a continuation of the haves and the have-nots, but nobody's taking care of the have-nots. When you look at the public health situation, the public safety situation, the moral situation, the economic development situation, what do you think the county's mission is? Public health, public safety, public morals, and economic development. But they don't have the money to go into a colonia. So it's either the city that expands and annexes one, and that's not happening, or then you have folks, that's the hook. Okay, then you have folks that are moving in, and they're moving into colonia areas, and you have subdividers, developers coming in, and they're making gated communities. But you know, with gated communities, security, water, wastewater, and sewer, because Loniana Water right now is building sewer lines so that the city can make capacity, or it has allowed provisions to it. Accept the capacity from the sewer lines. And I know that because I'm on the Colonias Infrastructure Board, and we've been appropriating monies not only to the Lower Rio Grande in the South Valley, but to Loniana Mutual in the North Valley, and we'll go into Chapter 3 on the next round.
Okay, before you get to the Colonias Infrastructure Trust Fund, can we go back one slide?
Where are these? Are these online?
The colonias?
This stuff here.
Yeah. The slide, I can make them available to you. Did you give me your email and I'll send them to
Why
you?
don't you put them online? Just, I'll put them online so we can.
Yes, most of this information is online on county government. And I'll give you every one of them has a source, and I have a copy of the presentation so you can get the source. This is very complicated, but I wanted just to give you a sense. For the Colonias initiative, we identified 4 indicators: water, wastewater, roads, and sewage. So just those 4. So we said, how do we get our arms around those 4? So we rated so the community A being the best and E being the worst. So the community does not want to be an F community or an E community. That's a way of getting community involvement and community organizing. They want it to be an A community. So we had like a baseline, and the way we developed the baseline is actually having county staff. We have engineering, planning, roads, community development. All the department heads who helped us develop the baseline. We actually walked every community, in the next slide, to identify what is the boundary as determined by HUD, how that developed and established that colonia. What is the road that says this is the end of the colonia? And then we actually identify and map every colonia. That map is under, UNM has an amazing site for every single colonia in New Mexico, with every road, every map. So then based on knowing the boundary of each community, that's how we identify the roads that needed paved. That's how we identify if there was wastewater, sewage. And one thing that we did, we also identified flood control problems and concerns. We did it in 2003, 2004. And guess what? We had the floods in 2005 and 2006. So we had to relook at the whole criteria and reassess flooding, that criteria. So, in the next slide. So what we did is that we had a baseline in 2004, and then we went back, because at this point, we're not talking to you and telling you, between all this time, we were working with the community and actually having meetings with the legislators, the Senate, all our elected officials, and going to Santa Fe and meeting with Richardson, Governor Richardson, every year with capital outlay fund requests. And every community was taking their own and meeting around the table with the governor. This is what we need in our community, and this is why. So this capital outlay request is what got initially funding for the colonias to improve. So then you can tell that some of the colonias, I don't know if you can see it, but it's from some remained a D and D, and some of them improved, like Placitas from a D to an A. Some of them improved Rincon from a C to an A. So what is it that they improved? So then we looked at each of the colonias and said, Brody, for example, had roads, lights, emergency access. A lot of the colonias have only one road in, one road out. So there's no way, if there's an emergency, there's a fire, there's a huge issue. So we had another bridge in Rhodey, and then we also had drainage. So those are the issues that, so we had documented for the governor, for the legislators, what were the improvements that were made in the colonias from 2004 to 2010. So it was very, very concrete. And so at the end, we said 19 of the 37 colonias, those in red, improved. This information, this simple slide, is what we took to the Governor Richardson when we met with him. So Colonias Day in Santa Fe, and it continues to this day is in January. And that's when, if you want to say, how can I help Colonias and the residents that live in Colonias? Go to Santa Fe, to Colonias Day in Santa Fe, and advocate for those that need your voice. We presented this to Governor Richardson in 2010. Said, thank you. Based on the funding that the governor really focused on Colonias, there's been improvements. 19 have improved. But the challenge is that there still have many that need improvement. And given that he was ending his term, at that point, it was magical. He said, what can we do to continue improving the Colonias in Doña Ana County? That's when we partnered with the tribal governments. And that Commissioner Butler took the lead and also worked with the legislators to see how can we develop, and that's when he was talking, the Colonias Infrastructure Trust Fund. How do we develop a funding source to continue improving the Colonias infrastructure? As you may know, if we would say we need additional funding, the legislators up north went up in arms. Why should we continue? We put aside money for Colonias in Doña Ana County. Why should we care? The question. But at that point, that's when the native tribes said they care. Colonias are frontier communities, as many people also say. So the tribal governments have similar issues, and that's when we partner with Representative Cervantes. Mary Kay Papin was instrumental. Mary Helen Garcia, Joseph Cervantes. It was amazing. But in my view, the legislators did not care and did not commit that because it was us. If I was a county staff just asking for the information and for the funding, they would not have reacted. The reason they rallied behind for the funding is because the community was involved. The community knew the road that needed to improve, and the community had the capital outlay. The community met with county engineers, and the community knew when that contract could be awarded and how long that contract needed to be in place. How long from the time the contract was awarded to when the project could be completed. So the community involvement, the community voice is what got the monies to improve those colonias. So the Department of Finance Administration would go to the meetings with the governor. And in 2010, when Richardson, before he left, we rallied with the community again, and there was a bill submitted to the. So that's when I turned into Commissioner Butler again. But that funding continues to this day, and Commissioner Butler continues to be the co-chair of that funding source.
Let me briefly touch on the funding. Yeah, the Colonial Infrastructure Fund, which was enacted in 2011, and we started in 2012. I've been on the board since then, and to the date, hasta la fecha, to the date, that it's from severance tax. We get 4.5% of gas and oil tax to fund infrastructure projects in these colonias, but in 12 counties. There's 12 counties from Eddy County to Hidalgo and Cantón County up to Socorro County. And the reason for that is that the Colonias Infrastructure Fund leverages a lot of federal funds. And from 2012 to the present, the Colonias Fund has appropriated $75 million in the area, but we leveraged it with federal funds, USDA, EPA. We now have about $121 to $125 million that we're putting into these communities. But as they mentioned earlier, up in Eddy County, that whole community, their wells went, and maybe there's 1, 2 wells supplying, 200, 250 homes, they went down. And right now they are carrying water in tanks into the community to sustain them in terms of domestic for whatever uses. But the other funds, Water Trust Board, Drinking Water Fund, Nat Bank, BAC, there are funds. And yet the problem is so great. They said that just within our county itself, it would be $1 billion to bring all the communities up to the infrastructure level that we enjoy at our homes.
Okay, so I'm gonna recap. So in the 1950s in Chicago, we had the rise of urban sociology. And folks in Chicago sent their best scholars throughout Latin America. And they began to study Latin American cities and said, what is it that we can learn from Latin American cities? Come back to the United States and look at urbanization through a different lens. So Lewis Wirth came up with the concept of urbanization and urban life. And he defined urban life with 3 characteristics: population size, density, and heterogeneity, diversity. He says, you want to define city life? You need size. You need people. You need density. They need to be concentrated so that we can deliver services. And heterogeneity. Colonias have none of the 3 major factors to define them as cities. So they tend to be peri-urban, close to cities, and we have this rural-urban dynamic. Now, someone asked, are they our U.S.-Mexico border, or what about Alaska? No, they're very U.S.-Mexico border as a phenomenon. We don't see colonias in northern parts of the United States. Someone asked, how are they different from homesteading? There's something very critical that I want to share with you, because we tend to blame the poor. We tend to define these communities by their deficits. You like water, you like plumbing, you like roads. Imagine walking around your entire life with a sign on your chest indicating everything we're deficient in. How would that make you feel? Horrible. Less than. Ashamed. This is what we've done to these communities. We label them for their deficiencies. And I want us to flip it around. I want us to alter that paradigm and say, what is it that they provide? They provide a year-round labor force. They provide an infusion of language, of culture, of different dynamics. Otherwise, these rural communities would go bust, like they are going bust all over the world, because the world is becoming more globalized and more urbanized. But who will feed us? Who will feed the cities? Who will provide us with this incoming energy to replenish our labor force, our schools? We are intricately connected, yet we've developed these exploitive relationships. What most people don't know, and if we haven't covered that, many of these lands were traditional farmlands. People came and they raked off the topsoil and sold it. And then they started subdividing and subletting. But they did so in a rent-to-own model. Give me $150 and the land is yours. Right? And just pay every month until you pay it off. And sign this contract. Those contracts were done without much government oversight. This is the cost of the lack of regulation. This is the cost of the lack of government oversight. Exploitation. The exploitation of the poor. And if you know anything about U.S. history, we've given people contracts in languages they don't know and said, sign here. And that's how we've taken their land. We've stolen people's lands. We've stolen a lot. But we don't want to feel guilty about that, right? Lots of these land deals. There was a student of mine, he actually did his research. That same property that his family was sold to 3 families. The person who sold them that land knew that one of the families would skip a payment. And then when you skip a payment in a rent-to-own deal, you lose all rights to that land. This has been the history that most people ignore of how colonias have developed. The lack of oversight, the lack of regulation, and the exploitation of the poor, right? So oftentimes it's just pay us $150 and keep my paying. I found in El Paso County, I still find those signs. $150 down, land is yours. That sounds great. And what most people don't know is that we've sold land to people in Germany. Say, come own a piece of the American pie. Just send us the money and pay. People come, I want my piece of Texas, I want my piece of land. Good luck, there are no roads. There's no water, there's no land. How did we do that? So we not only have we exploited the poor, we've exploited anyone that has been exploitable, right? And this has been going on for too long. So my ask of you is, why does community matter? Why do these communities matter to us as people of consciousness? How do we see us interconnected with our rural communities, with our neighbors around us? How can we make them visible? So that when we talk to people, you say, come visit us, or walk with me, or can I drive with you? Right? Ask people, take me there, let me see this. Right? One time I took people from California, they wanted to say, oh, let me, show me your research. We got stuck. But one of the neighbors said, oh, it's the anthropologist that came from California. They brought out some chains and they pulled me out.
Joint powers agreement to loop lines, they're going in with, I believe, 16-inch mains to get them the water they need. And so Doriana Water is looping all that area, Picacho, San Isidro, and bringing in a vacuum sewer system in San Isidro, the Colonia. But yeah, Picacho Hills, they had a water system that were going to the PRC because they weren't getting any water pressure. If somebody was making coffee and some person's wife was washing her hair and there was a flush, the whole water system wasn't there. So that's in an affluent community, right? And so they took that particular system away from that owner, that private owner, and Doriana Water bought that system. And so they put in another tank for more pressure, right? And so then if you go right across from Picacho Hills, on the south side of I guess it's Main Street or Highway 70, there's another colonia back there, in that area, maybe about 40 homes, that their systems, their wells completely broke down, and Doriana Water went in there and did an emergency tie-in.
Sorry, we went over time, but we have, if we need to, some of the questions, if you want answers to those questions, we'll stay for another 15 minutes. But thank you very much.